Hello, everyone. Good afternoon to those in Washington. Good morning to those further west. Good whatever to those wherever. I'm pleased to be joined. I'm Jane Harmon, the president and CEO of the Wilson Center, and very pleased to be joined by a very special and talented politician, Senator Joni Ernst, who is with us to discuss a topic of enormous importance, which is gender-based violence and her work to address this critical issue. Welcome, Joni. Delighted to have you.
Thank you. Thanks, Jane.
So this year, building on the momentum of our 16 days of activism against gender-based violence programming, the Wilson Center is expanding our initiative to examine gender-based violence. That is a mouthful. But anyway, GBV, for the shorthand is GBV, as part of our rule of law focus. We are speaking with members of Congress to highlight how legislative debate shapes U.S. policy responses to GBV. And we are speaking to one of the leaders in Congress. Let's be clear, there is an epidemic, hear me, epidemic, it's a pandemic actually also, of gender-based violence in the United States. According to the CDC, 1 in 4 women in the United States will experience sexual violence, physical violence, or stalking by an intimate partner during her lifetime. The current health crisis, the COVID health crisis, has exacerbated violence against women with strict lockdowns, economic instability, limited hours that courts are available, and very busy hospitals, among other challenges, making it even more difficult for victims of GBV crimes to get help, let alone justice. And again, this is happening all around the world. Nationwide coordination on this critical issue has further been hampered by the failure of Congress to reauthorize the Violence Against Women Act, one of the cornerstones of Senator Joe Biden's service in Congress, and certainly something I have always supported as well. It expired in 2018. As an early co-sponsor myself, as I just said this, and as an advocate for ending the epidemic of rape and sexual assault in our military, I personally am disappointed to see that toxic politics have crippled our ability to hold perpetrators accountable and respond to the needs of victims. The Biden administration will likely make reauthorizing VAWA, the Violence Against Women Act, a priority, but it will ultimately be up to Congress to reconcile differences over key legislative provisions. In 2014, Senator Ernst was elected as the first woman to serve in federal elected office from the state of Iowa. Go, Joni. Yes. And also the first woman combat veteran elected to serve in the United States Senate. That's huge. Since then, there have been others. Good news. She serves on 5 committees, only 5: Armed Services, Agriculture, Nutrition and Forestry. Oh, that is one committee: Agriculture, Nutrition and Forestry, Environment and Public Works, Judiciary, and Small Business. She served in the Iowa State Senate from 2011 to 2014, and in the Iowa National Guard from 1993 to 2015, retiring as a lieutenant colonel. Senator Ernst, you have emerged as a leading voice in the Senate debates on VAWA, and your 2019 proposal would have authorized grant programs and expanded resources for survivors, with an emphasis on reaching women in rural communities and tribal communities, funding domestic violence shelters and victims' rights programs, enforcing larger penalties for child sexual abuse, and addressing female genital mutilation. Although your work on a compromise bill with Senator Dianne Feinstein from my state of California ultimately fell through, the question of reauthorization has gained new urgency over the past year, and we're thrilled that you have just a little time to spend with us to talk about this emergency. So before I hand this program over to our very able Anya Prusa, who leads the Wilson Center's project on gender-based violence, I want to ask one question. Why is this issue so important to you?
Well, thank you, Jane, so much. And to the Wilson Center as well for really highlighting this, as you said, Jane, epidemic. It really is an epidemic. And why is it so important to me? It is because these issues have touched my life personally as well. And as a young woman, and this is uncomfortable to talk about, Anya and I have discussed this previously. These are issues that are hard to talk about, but something that we need to. When I was a young woman at Iowa State University, I was raped by my boyfriend. And it is unfortunately not uncommon. And as uncomfortable as it is to talk about, it is very important that we understand that there are resources necessary for young women to become educated on and find ways out of abusive, toxic relationships. So I did move out of that relationship, but then during my marriage as well, I went through a very difficult time of emotional abuse, and on one occasion, physical abuse, domestic violence by my husband, where I had to take my daughter and flee to my mother's home. So, you know, difficult circumstances. And it's just important that everyone realize that socioeconomics are not at play here. Anyone can be affected by gender-based violence. And I think it's important that now, as a United States Senator, that I share that message, that anyone can be impacted by this. And that is why it is so important for me to step out on this issue and make sure that others are aware that there are ways out of these situations and there are resources available.
I thank you for being so brave. We're turning this over to Anya now, but I just add that anyone, regardless of party affiliation, can be a victim of domestic violence. And I just wish that your institution, not you personally, would keep this in mind and move along smartly and reauthorize this bill.
Jane, you were spot on. You know, it's not Republicans, it's not Democrats, but I think this is an area where women really can step up. And we've heard other Republicans and Democrats, House and Senate, share their personal stories and how it has impacted their lives. And that's where we really need to lean heavily on our women to find solutions. So again, I'm grateful to be here and share some thoughts with you about that today.
Well, we're grateful to have you. Over to you, Anya.
Thank you, Jane. And thank you, Senator, as well, for being with us. I just want to echo Jane in saying we really appreciate you sharing your story, as well as the work that you've been doing in Congress. Really incredible to see you stepping up in that way. And, kind of building on what you said yourself in terms of, your own experiences informing your work. How do you think the growing presence of women within Congress has been shaping debates over gender-based violence?
Well, I think this is so important, and Jane will understand this too, that we need more women serving in Congress. And when VAWA was first authored, it was, as we've said before, it was a bunch of men and just a handful of women serving in the Senate at that time. And we have advanced now where we have 24 women serving in the United States Senate, and that's phenomenal. But certainly women feel more comfortable talking about these issues and finding, at least in my experience, talking about these issues, sharing personal stories about these issues, as hard as it is to do, we find it's important to talk about it. But then how do we find the right solutions to make sure that we are stepping in, preventing assault, preventing that gender-based violence? What is the practical application out there? Women know those issues inside and out, and we can come together and find solutions.
And one of the areas where you've really focused is on helping women in rural communities get access to the services and the support they need. Why is that so important, and what needs to be done?
Well, it is important because oftentimes, especially in this bubble known as Washington, D.C., many of those people that are actually working on these bills, the staff members, the members of the Senate, might be from a more metro area. And you may have a number of different domestic violence shelters or assault care centers located within the confines of the city. But when you go out into the rural areas, the areas like where I'm from, you may be 60 miles away from a resource, a shelter. And so it is really important to take that rural perspective and share that, because the solutions that may work in a metro area may not work in the rural areas. So adding my voice to that and making sure that whatever solutions we're including in VAWA is not negligent of the people that live in very rural areas. If a woman is working in her community, has children going to school in her community, it is not feasible for that woman, when she is trying to leave the home, to have to move 60 miles away to a shelter. So making sure that we're thinking about special accommodations where we can keep a woman within her community, where she may have familial support, where she may have, friend support, keep her kids in a level of continuity. That is really important. So we just have to have different types of voices speaking to those issues. And I really think it's important that we recognize the challenges of our rural areas.
That's so critical, right? To recognize that gender-based violence encompasses all these different challenges, and that, the solutions that might work for one woman might not work for another. And so we need to be cognizant of how we reach as many as possible.
Right.
And so one of the other things that you have looked at specifically is female genital mutilation, right? Which is another facet of gender-based violence. And I think it's one that, perhaps wasn't on the radar as much in 1994 or during initial discussions for VAWA. But as we've, come to understand within the policymaking community, this broader sense of what violence against women is, what gender-based violence is, female genital mutilation has certainly been one of those issues that we're looking at. Could you speak to, maybe first of all for our audience, explain what female genital mutilation is?
Yes, certainly. And yes, absolutely. And I have been working with Senator Marsha Blackburn on this issue. And again, it is one that coming from my rural community in Southwest Iowa, it was not something that I knew much about until I came to the Senate and started working on more of these issues. But with female genital mutilization, it is a practice that is done in different immigrant communities. It is done globally. There is great concern with that. But in certain even Muslim populations where there is cutting or mutilating of a female's genitals is typically done very early in a woman's life, typically done children from the time they are born up until about the age of 15. But certainly it's an abhorrent practice that we don't find acceptable in the United States. It's not done with the consent of those young girls. So we really need to focus our efforts on this. It comes down to just basic human dignity and protecting those young women, those young girls from that type of mutilation. So we really are mutilation. So we need to make sure that we are working heavily, working with other members within Congress to get this done. Oftentimes it gets bogged down in more immigration type work, but we need to think about it as just a basic human right rather than just focusing on larger picture items. So if we can focus on FGM, make sure we're protecting young girls and women, I don't know why we haven't been able to come together on that. So hopefully, as we're moving forward with VAWA in this Congress, we can get that done.
And I think that really highlights the need for greater education in general, right? Among not just lawmakers, but also among the public, among law enforcement, among the people who are tasked with enforcing the laws.
Yes, you are right, Anya, you are right.
And so, looking ahead, as we think about, prospects for reauthorizing VAWA in the year ahead, what are some of the things that you think need to happen in order for Congress to pass a bipartisan bill addressing some of the points we've discussed?
Well, and I think this is a really good year to be working on it. And unfortunately, as Jane alluded to earlier, toxic politics. And Dianne Feinstein, Senator Feinstein of California, and I ran into that in this last year. It does come down to politics sometimes. And I was up for re-election. And when you have leadership that says don't work with folks that are in an election cycle, it makes it very hard to get things done. We as Congress need to get over that. We need to focus on what is the good for the nation and come up with smart policies that can be accepted by both parties and move that policy forward. So I am still very hopeful that I'll be able to work with Dianne and other members of the Democratic Party. We have a number of women on the right that really want to see this piece of legislation done as well. So I think we have a brand new opportunity. The doors have been opened in this Congress, and I'm ready to get to work. But some things that I would like to see in VAWA, of course, as we talked a moment ago, focusing on the rural areas, making sure that we are adequately addressing the needs of more rural communities as well as our tribal communities, making sure that FGM is included in the package. And then, of course, addressing the educational needs and domestic violence needs. We want to educate, just as you said with FGM, we need to educate the public on what to watch for, what to be aware of, how to avoid, I think for our young women, how to avoid toxic relationships, which oftentimes lead to sexual assault, sexual violence, domestic violence. I think that is very important. So there are a lot of issues that we want to focus on heavily in VAWA. We still have those programs funded right now. So while we haven't reauthorized, we're still providing for supports necessary, but there are so many of us that really want to see the reauthorization and the modernization of this package.
And I wonder if you would be able to speak a little bit to what you see of the role of Congress in this debate being, right? We've talked a lot about VAWA, but obviously a lot of these programs are being implemented at the state and local level. So how can Congress support the work that is being done within communities?
And that's where we have to come back together and make sure that VAWA is reauthorized, but then that we're also providing the resources necessary to meet the goals of the Violence Against Women Act. If we're not adequately funding various programs, it's really hard for our state and our local officials to, follow through on those types of programs that support a very broad population across the United States. But we also need to be leaders in speaking out against gender-based violence. It's not acceptable to be silent on the issue. And while it is really uncomfortable to talk about a number of these topics, it's just important that we do it. We need to make sure that young women out there understand that if they're in a relationship that is harmful to them, they don't have to stay in that relationship. We need women to understand that if you need to seek help or if you have been sexually assaulted, there are programs available. After my own sexual assault in college, I volunteered at a woman's crisis shelter. And I was very blessed to have had support from them and determined that it was a way for me to give back. But if we hadn't had funding necessary to keep that shelter open, to provide the hotline where we took crisis calls, to provide the supports necessary for women and their children to escape batterers, it's all for naught. So we do need to step up as Congress, provide leadership in those areas, and that way, those local programs can continue to exist.
Anya, can I just barge in for 1 second,
Yes.
because I'm listening to this, and I want to ask Joni, is there anyone in Congress, you don't have to name names, who actually thinks we don't have a problem with this? I mean, I would assume there might be some issue about level of funding, but is there anybody out there who says this is not an issue?
And Jane, yes, and I have heard no one say that this is not an issue. People recognize that violence against women and gender-based violence is an issue. But again, it's so uncomfortable to talk about, and especially amongst the men, you know, recognizing that it does happen and talking about it are just on different spectrums. And so sometimes it does become the responsibility of those of us that have worked in this area and maybe have personally experienced this to step forward and say, okay, I'm going to take the bull by the horns. And so it becomes our responsibility then for crafting legislation that some of those men will be comfortable with, you know, whether they are Democrats or Republicans, bring them together and get it done.
Well, some good news today, at least I read this, is the new Secretary of Defense is going, he is going to focus on sexual assault in the military, which is a gigantic issue, as you know.
It is. And so that was one of the issues that I talked with General Austin, now Secretary Austin, about privately as well as publicly. This has been an issue in the military, and he's ready to step up and assist with that.
I apologize, Anya. This is your show. I'm sorry.
You asked wonderful questions, Jane, so always happy to have you jump in. I know we need to wrap up. So Senator Jane, I don't know if either of you have any final thoughts.
Well, I would love to once again say thank you to the Wilson Center for being engaged and active in this area and working with members of Congress, as well as many other organizations to combat gender-based violence. I'm just very thankful that we do have people that recognize it's an issue. And it's up to us as members of Congress now to come together and find those solutions. But we can't do it alone. We do rely heavily on state and local partners, whether they are nonprofits or others that are privately supported institutions. But we've all got to come together and really find a path forward for this. So thanks so much, Anya. And Jane, as always, it's so good to see you, and look forward to working with all of you on many issues in the future as well. So thank you.
Yeah. Let me just add, thank you, Joni, and to amplify something you said about the fact that women work together and women support each other on issues like this, not just this issue, but the women's caucuses in Congress, I found, are much more productive than any other caucus. And we have dinner together and are friends with each other, regardless of party. And this issue is going to depend on women. Unfortunately, it's great about the new Secretary of Defense, but hey, there are important women in the Pentagon and also really important voices in Congress. And maybe there'll be more voices in Congress. 24 is a good start. It's a good start, but it's only a quarter of the Senate.
That's right.
If it were a majority of the Senate, oh my God, how much could get done? Anyway, thank you so much.
We're gonna get there, Jane.
Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Anya.